So, hi there, Yesim.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, thanks. Thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat today. I think I'm gonna end up learning a heck of a lot, and I think this is one of these subjects where I think anyone listening might think, oh, I know what user testing is all about. This is going to be, what could I possibly learn? But I kind of feel this is actually like usually the subject that is ripe for the most learning when it looks easy, but is actually a lot of subtlety to it. So I'd love to get into a wider discussion about user testing and why it matters so much in product development and indeed any experience development. So I guess a nice place to begin would maybe be sort of defining what it is, and then maybe we could get into sort of common mistakes and best practice of how to do it.
Perfect, sounds great, I think. Do you want me to explain a little bit more what I think the user testing is?
Yeah, what do you think it is today?
I think I will start with the common mistakes, probably. For example, I usually, when I talk about user testing, usually there are three important areas. One is observations, and then the other one is insights and the facts. And usually we think that our observations are our insights, and we kind of get to mix them up with our own user testing. And I think that's a really common mistake, because we look around, you look at your child, for example, and then you say, oh, she didn't like the red color and I'm going to use the blue color instead. It's kind of like a super, it's just an observation. That's the most important thing that we need to realize, especially coming from the toy industry and, doing a lot of research, understanding children and toddlers, especially toddlers, because I usually mostly work with younger ages. And you have to understand there are some of the things which are facts, psychological facts, which doesn't change. Even there are so many impactful things happens, it doesn't change. That's the one thing. And then insights are so much more general, it's kind of more common and it's cultural, and you really need to understand those differences. And then your own very much, close-knit kind of observations, which becomes your hypothesis so that you can test your insights. Mm. And I think that's really important for me to get that one in the right way.
So I know it's always painful asking this question, because I'm aware that we've all got to be respectful of confidentiality. But were there any examples in your experience where just you can speak holistically, where you felt, oh gosh, that really opened my ideas up to an assumption which was all too easy to make and could have led to a completely wrong insight or outcome in the development journey?
Yeah, I have a very recent one, and it was my mistake. I was so sure. I was so sure that the retail world is kind of diminishing, and especially in Europe and UK. And I was working with a client from Europe, so I made this. I said, retail is going to be gone, so we need to go totally online, and that's kind of like the common thing that we should be doing. I'm super believing in that. Then I realized I'm totally wrong within that culture. It's a Middle Eastern culture, so it's kind of like they are still wanting to go a certain place, and they want to look at things, they want to open the package, they want to make sure the things are like the products are inside and they are in one piece. And when you understand that personality, then my hypothesis was completely wrong. So then I'm like, okay, now I understand there's still time for it, but then you respect the user testing, and that you should be actually always testing your knowledge and get it right.
And I mean, I guess what you're sort of getting into is the nuances of the fact that we think we're all the same, but of course we're all different.
Yeah.
And cultures are such the whole reason there is the phrase that culture clash is just, it is such a big shock to the system sometimes to be in something which it isn't even necessarily always big social taboos and things that make you angry or frustrated. It can just be going, oh, I had absolutely no idea you were going to take it in that way.
Yeah.
And
so, that's the excitement. that's the fun part of researching. You want to find something so completely opposite of what you were thinking. I think you need to, that's the time you need to realize you need to take your own biases, your own knowledge away from the content, whatever you are researching about. You have to be an observant person, and you need to take yourself away from it, one step away, maybe a couple, and then relook at the whole thing again.
So I guess I'm curious to know. I guess it's fair to say, obviously, observing skills of critical empathy is obviously talked a lot about. But I guess you could say immersion is also important. I mean, I guess you could say there's a parallel with some actors or theatre, that there's a debate on whether method acting, putting yourself in a viscerally real experience in order to better empathize. Do you think that's always necessary in user experience testing, or can it be done through more intellectual or distance methods?
I mean, in some cases, probably you can put yourself and immerse yourself into it. In some cases, you won't be able to do it. You can't be a baby, for example. You can't go back to that. I think you need to do it in an intellectual way, and you need to understand some of the facts before you even go and observe it. Otherwise, you won't be able to understand what is really going on. You need to understand the language of it to be able to make the sense of it, I think.
Yeah, no,
if it makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I guess was there any, I guess one thing, an example that comes to mind, which I really don't think is a proprietary insight from Lego, but it was certainly something that was banged home to me, is knowing the difference that at different ages you have to appreciate that the older you get, the more influence you have on the buying of a product. And yet, obviously, as a baby or a toddler, even if they are somehow seeing, adverts on TV, which you hope is minimized, but really the target is the parent in terms of sales, but the child is actually the end user. But then you also have to realize the parent is still part of that use cycle, because they're also usually interacting with it very intensively. So, should we say a student at the beginning of their training might be like, who's the end user for Duplo? It's a baby, it's a toddler. But really, actually, it's quite a lot bigger than that. So I wondered, are there any other, sort of, obviously we can't give brand specifics, but have there ever been any shocks that you think, gosh, I had no idea that was actually the full journey of the user decision-making process?
Let's come to the point. Maybe the diapers, that will be interesting to look at, for example. You always think that diaper does a certain job and that's it, and it finishes, it's very quick. But I think the most important journey of that is why do you buy it, first of all, and who is buying it? And then the user has to feel comfortable with it. And the technology of that paper technology is amazing. That I had no idea about. I was like thinking, okay, that's just a diaper. But but then when you think about the whole, how it takes the whole liquid and all the substances, and what are these kind of technologies and everything, and how do you make the user comfortable, and also the buyer, who is the mom or the dad or whoever, is actually understanding when it's kind of needs to be taken away. So there are all these kind of different kind of pivotal times. And in that design process, you really have to go and think about every small detail. And in that, especially particularly in that kind of a content, I think it's the technical piece becomes super important. Like how it's designed and what's the engineering behind it. But for different kind of projects, it's completely different. For example, I can't give a brand name, but for the toddlers to open caps, like and how they use their hands, and super hard. Like you imagine they can't do it at the age of 2, but when you do a user research, you understand actually those kids can do it. It's just the timeline is maybe a bit more exaggerated. They will have to try because their fingers are not developed properly. But then all of a sudden you realize actually they are super capable of doing it. It's just sometimes parents don't have the time or the patience to give them and let them do it. So how can you change the design accordingly? Then the whole user journey changes, and you start to understand there are so many other ways actually you can help that child to develop like hand skills and dexterity skills, and that comes with also the happiness of the parents to deal with the toddler frustration.
Well, I guess I should say, you know, having been a dad recently myself, there's a reoccurring phrase that my wife and I always use of when motivated, in that our son, you know, you think, oh, can't do this, but when motivated, he will achieve, you know, seemingly impossible feats of dexterity or strength or even cognitive ability. So I think it's interesting to consider the run-up to getting someone to do something in terms of interaction. It can actually happen way further down the line.
And the best thing for me in that particular project, it was really just watching how they are doing it. And not even touching them, not asking any questions, just watching. And that was the most important piece, like, you know, looking at all these details, how the hand is turning, twisting, is the fingers, you know, all these qualities, the hand qualities, and how they use it, and how they speak, and what's their patience. You learn tons of information from that, just looking at them.
So I wonder whether we could, because you're touching on something which I think was, you know, it's not to say that this always has to be about students and undergraduates, but I know two things I picked up when I was learning in Norway. And one is to of course observe people in silence, and you just let them do their thing. And then another recommendation was to ask them to talk through what they're doing. So you'd video them, and let's say there's the nappy example. They'd say, well, I'm picking this, you know, tab off and I'm sticking it there. And usually people will be very black and white. And then the third question is to run it through with some people going, don't just tell me what you're doing, but explain to me how you're feeling. And so then it moves to a level of, okay, I'm doing the strap, but let me tell you, if you get any moisturizer on your, or nappy cream on your finger, it ruins the strap, and then it never sticks, and it makes me so angry. And then before you know it, you've actually got what I guess the professionals would call a sort of key insight. And then you're looking for, does that repeat over, you know, 8 out of 10 parents had said exactly the same thing if you provoke them. But I feel the subtlety is that when you start your career, you sometimes just observe with too much distance, and it's the knack of getting people to open up. So I wondered, you as someone who's spent years doing this, what other little tricks and techniques have you learned that just get something that could be quite dull and easy to overlook and actually yield a huge opportunity?
I think sometimes, first of all, I think the most important thing is when you are kind of approaching anyone, you have to be making them feel comfortable talking to you and being openly talking to you. Because the biggest problem is sometimes they just, you ask a question and they please your answers. And that's, you don't want. You want honesty, right? You want honest pains. That's what I want to see. Like, honestly, they are sharing what is really not working or what is really making them feel happier, so that you can understand what you can add from your perspective. So I encourage people to ask open questions so that they can feel comfortable and answering your questions. Otherwise, you start to direct them. The other thing I usually do, and this is my, in the last 8 years, I create a playful environment and I ask people to play. It's not necessarily playing with the specific project which I'm trying to solve, but I give the underlying problems that might happen with the playful objects so that they can play and they can almost mimic the situation so that I can get more information. Because in that playful environment, there is nothing that they are playing. It's super vulnerable, it's so open, and people become very much happy to have fun, but also have, if there's nothing is not really well working, then they will come back to you and tell you. So if it is kind of mimicking a similar problem that will occur in the product that I'm actually testing, then I actually get an honest answer. And honest kind of imaginative scenarios also, because scenarios are really important. How they are going to use it, where they are going to use it, more than even if it is working at that time. But it's more important in which time they will be trying to use that. For example, I was a marathon runner, so it was super important for me what type of bottle I'm going to be using while I'm running. So you can use so many different types of bottles that kind of makes you feel okay. But while you are in a marathon run, you just want to be in the zone and you don't want to be disrupted, which means that water bottle has to work super easily. You shouldn't be feeling it. So I was always imagining I wanted to have something which is different kind of things. You become your own user journey. You test yourself and you put feelings next to it. You put exactly what you are saying, the timing and when and how you are going to use those kind of questions actually brings you the perfect product.
I'm kind of curious, actually. You mentioned something which I guess, I'm deliberately using the jargon because you've just explained what it is, but a frictionless experience is sometimes what it's called, or being sort of unobtrusive. And I found it quite interesting that one of the things I've learned recently is that you're trained at university to always look for frictionless and make it simpler and make it easier. And then actually you start to, as you do in your professional career, you understand the shades of grey on the nuance. And I know that because I work quite a bit with people in, sort of development or apps or coding, and they say, yeah, we're probably one of the few people who actually also deliberately introduce friction, because otherwise people panic. Because sometimes computers can do things so fast that people don't believe it's happened. So I'm not going to name any names, but certain banking services, they actually have a little bit of, we're busy transferring your money, and it's complete smoke and mirrors. It's nonsense. That little bar going, we're thinking about this really, really hard and sending those monies, it's there to make you feel like, okay, I'll leave it alone. It must be doing it. Because actually, if it just went click, boom, done, which is what it actually does, you'd be like, oh, hold on, has it definitely worked? That £10,000, maybe I didn't click the button or something. And so actually, I feel there's some weird contradictions that come from the rule. And I wondered whether you had come across any other little things that seemingly didn't make sense, but do when you look at the bigger picture.
I think probably in the custom, for example, the queue line, that you actually you need to make it almost easier to adapt to the situation. So it's kind of, that's why. What is the need and what is the mission? And what we are trying to get out of this is the big question. And I think that's how you should start maybe your research, so that you can start to see different kind of patterns and how you can actually apply it to the product or the services you are designing. But in the customs, for example, if the queue is super going to be long, every time I always think about all of that snake, that trial drives me crazy, but it makes sense. Otherwise, you will have a very long, linear queue, which is going to make people so much frustration, and they are not going to be able to cope with that. At least this kind of makes it a bit more parallel, so it's kind of easier to digest.
You mean the act of turning a corner, even though it's still technically the long piece of string.
Yes.
It feels like something has changed and progress is being
because
made.
you are leveling up. You are kind of getting to the targets slowly, but you are getting there. Especially, I have waited for 2 hours in some queues, so I'm kind
of curious to know how much do you think of your work is about working with designers to say, you must design this out with better design or engineering or whatever, and how much of it is saying, this is a limited palette, I need to evolve the user experience so that it now feels comfortable?
It depends from a project to project and the timelines.
Of course.
And sometimes some timelines has no timeline. So you have to use the pre-information. But I think, especially if you are starting from out of a new idea, a very new idea, you have to do a couple of different user journey testings, and you have to make sure that it's kind of, I mean, one project I worked for 4 years, so that was a very long one. So that's beyond, maybe not that much, but it was super new, so it was kind of innovative, new direction. So in that one, you really need to understand if the market is even ready, if the people are okay and ready to take the new idea, because that, if they are not ready for it, they are not going to even try it. Some people will maybe go for it, but it's not going to become a sustainable product. So if you are changing the lifestyle of people, yes, you need to understand what motivates them, what are the things are changing in their environment, how it is going to be fitting into their lifestyle. So you need to have a different layers and different variety of user journeys to understand if it fits and if it's going to make a impact for them.
I mean, an example that comes to mind quickly is like the fashion industry. How, we used to insist on going into shops, whereas now there is. I'm not saying we're there and retail's dead, but retail is definitely suffering from, as soon as big companies started to say, "Don't worry, it's 3 returns," or they had. Not to name drop, but Amazon has a little thing that says how much was the fit, what you expected. So if you ordered a large, is it a little bit on the tight side or is it a little bit on the baggy side? All those things I feel, give increased confidence to consumers to trust taking a leap. But then I could also use another example of looking at things like animal protein and putting grasshoppers in chocolate bars. I mean, I've eaten these sorts of things and they honestly taste great. But I suspect, to your point about market readiness, it's going to be so difficult getting people to take that nudge to say, okay, I'm going to have a grasshopper, chewy bar. And like, how maybe we should run with that example. What are the prerequisites that a marketing company and also a technology company making these things need to consider in the process?
Well, first of all, I guess they need to make it playful in some ways. They need to understand like what are the motivations of people to eat a grasshopper. Okay, chocolate is already given, right? We like chocolate.
Half a win.
So so that's a half a win. That's something. But then you need to almost pack it up with some kind of a protein and information and how it is kind of changing. So to understand how much they are open for something very new. And in some cultures, they are very open for it. But some cultures it will be a very niche product, no matter how you try it. And even within that nicheness, then you need to understand why these people are going to be buying it, how much they are going to buy it, how often they are going to buy it, and then what is the even packaging going to look like, and why are they going to be interested in that? That's all those motivations and all those interests. I think you need to almost collect them to be able to make it appealing for them. Otherwise, it's just going to fall, especially for something like that.
And how much do you feel like when you're working with companies, do you sometimes have to almost educate them about the market readiness? Like if I was to have I'm just trying, forgive me for always going to food, but I guess if I look at things like the Impossible Burgers, these meat-free burgers, they're kind of fascinating because I remember back in the day there was like corn and things like facon, sort of fake bacon. And I think the problem with that is it was really trying to say this is literally a fake alternative. And of course it was always inferior. It always felt like a very, very poor substitute to the meat alternative. And I do wonder whether certain marketing, Impossible Burger is unusual in that it seems to be succeeding in emulating a meat experience. But then when I look at things like tofu, it feels like, the UK hasn't really understood tofu, but, my wife being from Hong Kong, I love tofu, but it took me a long time to keep trying different things because there's a million different things that Asia does with tofu, and I've never really considered it as a meat alternative. I just thought, oh, this is tofu, and I'm getting on board with the tofu experience and finding out what I like. So I guess my question is really, when are you framing something in a metaphor to say, you know this, it's like this, you're going to love it? And when are you saying, this is truly a new experience and I'm going to have to tell you and sell you why its new virtues are going to be exciting?
I guess it depends on from the food. It like, for example, in London it would be easier because everybody is used to open to anything new and they want to try it. So that's kind of like an adventurous archetypal community. So I would look at the archetypes. I would say, like, what type of people am I trying to get to, and if they are adventurous, then perfect. You can try different things. But if they are very much if they are very much conservative and they won't be able to try it, then you have to bring in maybe more factual information so that they can actually get ready for it. Mm-hmm. Because some people want to understand why I'm doing it. I mean, you always have to have this kind of like a why and the answer of the why, so that it kind of starts to make sense for the consumer. And I think, it's some are super trendy, so it becomes easier to actually even talk about them. And I think nowadays with the social media, you can make anything almost appealing if you actually put it together in the right voice, right way of actually explaining why it's interesting. And but I always go back to, when something is very new, I always go back to the playfulness. You need to have some humor or some playfulness inside it so it can actually stick with you. So, that's what I would say. I think because play has this element of connecting our own intellectuality. So that's why I think it doesn't need to be like childish, but it can be playful. Even serious playful, it doesn't matter, but you can probably bring it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, even you're wearing Apple's, by the looks of it, headphones, and I mean that wasn't a childish advert when they came out with their white wires, but it was childlike in that it was playful. It had dance, it had movement, it had color, it was exuberant.
Exactly.
So I think that if I've understood you correctly, is the interpretation of the playfulness in new things and new paradigms.
Because whatever you put out there, you are actually kind of creating a behavior of people. So they need to be almost imagine themselves within that scenario. So you are actually selling the story, which means they can imagine themselves in the middle of the story, that they are experiencing your product. Yeah, they are doing something with it, and it becomes their identity. So I think that's really important how you do it.
So maybe could we talk a little bit about identity? And I know we didn't intend to get on this, but it's fascinating now that you mentioned it. Is that it strikes me that maybe I'm wrong, but I had always assumed there was maybe once upon a time where people bought things because of a utilitarian function. If you're a caveman, you went, well, I want this sharp flint to cut open this woolly mammoth or whatever. And then there's a time where we are now where it's less about the product and it's more about the brand as a way for us to self-identify and also locate other people who want to be in the same tribe, or we would like to be in their tribe as well. Is that a misconception? Or if I had a time machine, cavemen and women would be just as inclined to use the flint group of knives as opposed to the bone group of knives, and but that's a jaguar bone, that's not as good as the elephant bone. Is this something that's in our DNA, or has this been evolved over society and compound effects of marketing over generations?
This is so funny. Now you just mentioned it that way. Now I have to think about complete something else. You know, when you look at dogs, for example, the way they, choose their sticks, because some they just, grab it and then they leave it there. So I guess it's kind of in our DNA, maybe. It's kind of like the material, how we kind of connect with that, the way it's been made. So who knows? I think it must be inside in our DNA in some ways. But of course, in time, now we are not in the caves. Well, we are kind of in the caves now. But I think nowadays it's, of course, the semiotics of materials. So it's really important how we associate all the things, and if they are shiny, if the color is that, and all of them are actually creating an identity, and even where you are coming from. For example, very easily I can say northern, like Scandinavian toys versus the American toys. There's a huge big difference in color variation, because usually they are much more pale and much more subtle, and then you go into the US, it's like bright and so vibrant. So we do have our cultural reasons why we choose certain things, and of course global brands are also making it probably more equalizing it, but they're all creating identity of ourselves. All the things around us is telling something about us, so we are choosing them without we know it. Unconsciously we are choosing our identity pieces, creating a puzzle of us actually. So yeah, I'm just thinking of the caveman, but anyway.
So you mean almost like brands, it makes sense that they are a way that we signal to each other of what our values are. My understanding has been that it's almost a shorthand to say, I could spend a lot of time getting to know you, but I can see from the whatever Nike sticker, Burberry sticker, Apple sticker that, oh, you must self-identify with that thing. So is it essentially just a shortcut to socialization and acceptance?
Yeah, it's kind of symbolic way of shortcut, but it depends on which part of that brand you are actually talking about. That's the part you need to probably figure it out, because I might say I like Nike because it's stylish, or I might say it's because of the values it's kind of talking about and how it is creating the brand. So I think they are very important, two different things. There is a variety of it, but still it's kind of overarching.
So I'd love to get into that actually. How do you feel that is there a theoretical limit to the virtues and values that a brand can hold? Because you're quite right in to say, do I buy a Rolex because I'm wanting to show off my finance, or do I buy a Rolex genuinely because I'm obsessed with is it chronometry and timekeeping, and I just really wanted something that was very good at it. What is the breadth, or is it that there's almost like they say we can only hold sort of 7 things in our heads simultaneously? Is there a limit to what brands can represent?
I mean, brands are themselves like identities, no matter what. So then I would go to the archetypal brand archetypes, which are like 12 different ones, like from innocent to heroic brands to lover brands. And so I don't want to go into too much detail, but then what I can say is every brand, if it's a really if it's a very strong brand that we can associate ourselves, they have their own identity. They are like people, and they have, of course, different kind of layers of in-depthness for them, and different characteristics and personalities. But as a whole, you see a certain kind of identity, no matter what they do, and that part is probably, we can say, that's their limit. I mean, that's kind of their shell, and that shell is, I don't think it will be too much changing and interchanging. It's kind of like more stable. I'm just going to give an example to make sure it's kind of a bit more simpler. So innocent brands, one of the innocent brands is, for example, Coca-Cola. That's what they associate it with. an archetypal way of looking at it, because they talk always about the friendship and how close to each other, and those kind of the voice of Coca-Cola is very much innocent. It's all about the closeness of people and the family and all of that. So they won't change that, and that kind of makes them one identity. That's their more core value, core importance. And I guess that's the limits, then, I would say. They wouldn't go against their core belief, probably. If they go, then they will start to shake.
Do you think it's a little bit like, I guess you could say, like the sort of Dylan goes electric moment? Are there points where brands have said, we absolutely can't afford not to change, but in doing so in the short term, it's going to be extraordinarily painful because we're going to lose things. But if we don't, we're losing our future.
They might, of course, they might have to do some kind of a serious short, cut of changing themselves, and then I'm just thinking who had done it, but oh God. Anyway, I'm not going to go there because I don't know, but they might change, yes. But that will be super, super hard. They need to create a new voice and new personality. But maybe in crisis, that might be easier because everybody is changing.
Okay, so this is exactly where I wanted to go, because I feel that quite often it's sort of said of humans that we don't really take sort of strong action unless we have a crisis. And it's not to always be about COVID, but I mean, I think many people have said, who've been interviewed after they've had like a near-death experience, say maybe, a cancer or something, which can be survivable after very painful treatment, that it leaves an indelible realization on them of going, I have to live my life differently. But at the same time, and at exactly the same time they're realizing that, they're questioning themselves, why couldn't I live that way before this near-death experience? And it's almost there's quite a bit of self-frustration of like, why couldn't I have just got there in my head? And I wonder, what does that say about us as humans from someone who studies experience?
Well, I mean, I kind of went through something like that because I lost my dad, and that was kind of a crisis for my own self. So that's very from my personal experience, I can easily say it. I think we are comfortable in our own comfort zones until it's been shaken and it's been torn apart. Then you really have to remake it. And in that remaking, you start to look at everything again, and you start to analyze what they define, what they mean for you for that time being. And so that you can actually say, okay, it's not like you change because you want to change. It's just because your whole understanding of your concept, your identity again, your knowledge of who you are has been shaken. So it's not there anymore what you used to know. You have to change. That's the only way. That's the outcome is the change, I would say. You just have to remake it. So that's why I think in the crisis it becomes easier to do it, because basically you are left with not anything anymore. It's kind of washed out. That's what I would say. But it depends. It depends for the companies. Yes, the crisis is probably seeing almost the end. Almost they really have to change. And in these kind of like today's, what we are going through, it depends on how big the crisis is going to be. Some companies have to going to change. They will have to change the way they do things, or they are going to merge their way of communicating and interacting and finding new ways of doing things. So crises are horrible things, but they are actually also very powerful in remaking of identities. So, yeah, it's quite interesting, I think. It tells a lot about us.
Yeah. Have you followed working with one particular company for an extended period of time and sort of should we say, gauge the emotional state of people as they go through, what is quite often a painful change, but then sometimes realizing that something good, there is a silver lining that can come from it. Be it understanding something better about what they do, or becoming more efficient or more mature as a company.
I mean, the companies that I worked with in the past, they are all very solid companies. I mean, they've been there for a very long time, so they didn't really go through any kind of craziness. But I have a feeling some of my clients, they might actually change because they had to. I mean, I have one which I'm sure they are going to definitely change. I'm really wondering how they are going to make that difference. But it's always going to be trying to find what is the diamond in them. You know what I mean? It's like, what is the most shiny element which they can make use of to the market, which is actually now they are also changing. So they are also expecting new things, and now it's a new way of connecting. And for that particular company, I'm sure they are going to change. And they might come as a much more stronger brand also.
Yeah, I mean, not to draw parallels with the chaos and inner turmoil that hardship brings to the individual. That is obviously very real and very different. But from a, should we say, strategic part of business, it feels like actually, it feels like what you're saying is the hallmark of great businesses, great teams, great leadership, is to maintain, should we say, an optimistic and should we say, curious attitude to find new opportunities.
I mean, one, for example, area we can definitely easily speak, and we are already experiencing most of us, is education. Education has been always in the classroom, and it was kind of easy to, teach anything by, grouping and sitting together. But I had to recently do a play workshop online pre-recorded, which was interesting for me with 120 students. I had to change immediately because the way how you do a project and how you facilitate any kind of workshop, it's quite interesting because your mind becomes much more creative. You start to feel it in your mind, but also you have to look at all the resources, and you have to use more empathy because you need to understand the end user, and also how do you communicate. And you make mistakes, of course, along the line, but you realize you can learn from that and you adapt. And that's the beauty of user journey, I think.
And I mean, do you feel that sort of the process of exploring users? Do you feel there are other industries that don't use it as much as they could, and you feel this would be great to venture into? Is there any areas that you feel this would be really exciting to work with?
Yeah, that will be amazing to work with, because some companies really think they use their own information in the, they think they know how to do things, but now I think definitely they will have to do user, experience and some kind of testing to understand because the knowledge, the information that we think we used to have, it's probably changed now. So, I mean, yeah, definitely.
And I guess one of the things you mentioned just in passing when we were discussing things a little while ago was saying the sort of disruption around things like consumables and collectibles.
Yes.
And you felt that really is getting flipped. So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, to come to that, I would say, I just went to the toy fair in Nuremberg. And seriously, this is what I'm thinking. It's been only at least 2 months. I mean, not more than that, definitely 2 months ago. And I was putting together all the trends and everything, and I was so sure, collectibles are huge, for example, and then raw materials are huge, kinetic sand and, all these dolls, slimes and everything. And today I'm sitting and thinking, really? Are we really going to be more playing collectibles, and what is the collectible meaning is going to be, because now everybody is inside and there are much more their awareness of, for example, sitting together and playing and having an experience is more important, whether they are with their families or not. But it is important to have an experience rather than just collecting things and then putting it there. So what is it going to be? What is the next generation of collectibles are going to be? And how it is going to change? And if the lockdown, for example, continues, how is it going to be online collectibles? And what are the differences going to be? You have to think about these digitalized ways of doing things. How do you share it? And how are you going to exchange, for example, because that's the most important thing. How do you display? So that's underneath the collectible trend, let's say, all these small things, the sub-elements. And then you think about the people and how they are behaving now. That's the wind, and how is it going to interact with all these underlying qualities. Then it's going to be your next generation of collectibles at the end. So I would look from a different perspective. So I'm thinking it's probably going to change. The other one is, for example, raw materials. It's been so crazy up until this whole COVID situation. Like, you will see a lot of slime videos and everything. I don't see it anymore. I don't know where they are gone. I don't know. I see more like people baking things and making things and not like sensory, because I think people in touch with their sensorial experiences more since they are at home and in the kitchen and doing things. So that's going to be a change probably. And also the other thing is, the virus and people being scared of not cleanness, and all those things are going to be very effective of how we choose things. But then, for example, you look at nature, one of the biggest trends, and I think that's going to be star of this year probably, that we should be now even more respecting to the nature, even more respecting to sustainability and understanding how we use our resources. Because now you go to a supermarket and you have to wait to get in. It was so easy. You would just go for one chocolate bar and go to your supermarket. Now you don't want to do that because it's going to take ages to get So that mindfulness is going to be, I think it's going to be very important. It's going to be probably will stay with us for some time, which means it's going to affect the trends that we have been talking about.
Yeah, no, I think it's fascinating, sort of how you develop what I'm trying to say is the things that you've said seem obvious in hindsight when you articulate them as well as you do. But I kind of feel that it's always that sort of irony that people don't see them, in fact. And so I wonder what is it that you feel, I guess to use the gym metaphor, what are the workouts that you do to train your sense of anticipation, observation, and not prediction, because I don't want to make it sound like a crystal ball, but it's like you're taking a calculated, reasoned extrapolation of this is likely to happen because these things are going on.
Are changing. I mean, okay, obviously we have been in that business, in that side of the business for a very long time. It's been 20 years. So you do get that intuition of where things are going. But if you are just starting and if you are just new to this industry, or even if I was in doing something for any industry, the most important thing is you collect as many information as you can to understand the framework of the industry, what is going on there, what kind of a bubble it is. So imagine like as if you are in so many different bubbles everywhere. So you put your head in and you try to understand what does it mean to be a good thing? What is good and bad, actually? You also, very conceptually, you need to understand what are the things, what is the system within that? What is the relationship between different kind of things going on, metaphorically? And then And then you start to see the behaviors within that world, the behaviors when something is actually a huge trend, how people behave and how they are actually getting excited and how they talk about it. And so you start to create almost super sensitive eye, ear kind of understanding of that world. You become this crazy person in a way. So you can sense anything going on over there. And then those kind of things. And then, of course, you have to look at outside. How it is affecting you and how it is most likely affecting other people. You listen to the conversations. And then those conversations become, at the beginning, you don't make sense of them. But then you realize, you start to get to the language. You start to hear exactly what they are saying. I'm saying it in a way like this is my second language. So when you learn your second language, in the beginning, if something is not perfectly said, you don't understand. But once you start to get to know exactly the language, the grammar, the whole mechanics of that language, you start to understand even if they don't say it perfectly. So it's exactly the same in the industry. You start to learn the mechanics of it and how the system is actually working. So the first thing is read a lot of things. Look at so many different areas. Try to find, it's almost like a detective work, you inspector. You go from one small information and you follow that, and then you go to the next and you find the thought leaders of that place. You find the most amazing innovations that is happening. And then you realize how it is affecting and how it's been going on for the last couple of years. And then you kind of make it almost align it with today. And then you start to see how it is going to be effective in the next couple of years. Yeah, I mean, we talk about also steep trends.
Yep.
I don't know if it's too much maybe, but...
No, please.
Steep trends is, I think it's very useful tool, at least to give you a framework of what the global world is doing. And then how do you actually take all those small pieces to, local trends. So it's the social, technological, economical, environmental, and political. And all those information is going to be hugely impacting the design of your, maybe design of this, like small, wooden block. And this is, for example, is a great example, because this is kind of like why is this in this shape? Why it's not even cubical? Why it's kind of changing? And all those trends, all those dynamics makes it maybe like this with weird shape, but it's actually a great tool.
I guess the follow-on question from this would be, you're speaking as someone who, as you said, has had many years of sort of developing, I guess what you could almost call as like antenna, to be able to pick up on weak signals. But I guess, how do you then translate what you're sensing to convince people who maybe haven't been doing as much work in that area as you have? I mean, obviously evidencing things with data is important, but I can imagine that also sometimes running experiments to be like, look, that was a weak signal, but here's the big signal that shows it was coming or it's arrived. So how do you go about that?
One important thing is, of course, to create a good scenario. And in order to create that good scenario, you need to have these answers, like coming from why it's happening and how it is changing, what has happened in the past, what is the timeline, and what are the patterns that you are seeing, so that it's actually coming into this today's situation. And with this pattern, it's almost very like equational in a way. With this pattern, if something like this is happening, what might happen? You create so many four different actually spectrum of scenarios. Like, what are the possible future? What is the dystopia? What is the utopia? All these kind of like bleak ones and good ones. And you kind of try to create a certain information. And then the people who, especially if you are, that's what we used to do, for example, at Hasbro, if you are showing it to the C-level, you have to give them a big picture, what is today, and then you have to explain them what might happen tomorrow. And within that tomorrow, what are these kind of threats that might happen, but what are the winners that will happen? So you almost have to, and then also you start to put the person who is our persona, the character of today, and how it is going to evolve, and what are the needs of that persona is going to be, so that you are actually answering their need. That means you are also actually giving a right kind of product to their hand. So it's kind of a lot of questions, I would say. You create a lot of questions, but you need to have a methodologically, they are kind of fitting with each other to create a bigger picture. You are, so that you can actually convince the people, this is the situation, that's why we need it. You are creating like a sci-fi movie, that's what I would say. The easy way of saying it. For a sci-fi movie, in that scenario, that product has to fit in it.
Well, I think maybe one of the misconceptions of I mean, I've just recently done a video series on sort of how science fiction is used to develop new products. And I meant it coming from the perspective of, it isn't that sci-fi predicts the future, but ironically, by painting compelling visions, it sometimes means companies will those fictions into reality.
Yeah.
And I think that I don't think that was, at least for me, that wasn't taught, or I didn't interpret it at university. And I felt it was something that I came to quite late in life, that there's a job of user experience to analyze, the present and the past. But then actually some of the most exciting work, and I know you see this too, is actually thinking, well, let's extrapolate what could be. And I think it sounds as simple as, quite often human nature is to live in the present. It's hard work to look at the past because it requires scholarly work, but it's actually quite hard to imagine the future because it requires a creative leap of something that you can't empathize with necessarily, or feel, or have a metaphor to. So I guess I wondered, just maybe as to give a bit of closing, what examples or inspirations would you maybe recommend of understanding that complete journey?
Well, there's a lot of future studies. That's one thing. There are. It's actually becoming such a big thing, so that will be really nice to look at. There's one book which I would say, Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, which is an old book, but I think that will be very inspirational to read it, because he does say over there, like, future shock is if the culture is not ready for it. Even though if we say exponentially everything is changing, it doesn't mean it's going to change, because if behavior is not there, then it's not going to be ready for it. So I kind of like it very much. The predictions, we can make so many predictions, but we need to still understand we are human beings and we have certain ways of understanding how we behave with each other and what we like, and that actually stays. That's more reality. And so we can definitely read it. I would recommend that. And yeah, but I think there are and also really great sci-fi movies. I think that will be excellent to give that imagination, to understand how actually like Minority Report, for example, was a great one, because it was actually used so many inspirations from MIT Media Lab. Look at MIT Media Lab, for example. It's there are so many amazing places to look at, but once you start to understand, it almost becomes your own way of researching and being curious. And last thing I would say is be curious. Definitely.
I mean, I think that is the best thing a user researcher can be, really, isn't it? It's, and I do wonder whether it's one of those professions where, did you choose it or did it choose you? Because I certainly feel that about design and engineering. It's a strange thing, but honestly, this has been terrific speaking with you, and I think you've given some not just great insights, but also just it's so lovely to hear your own personal journeys and how you sort of work through ideas. So it's been a real pleasure and honor speaking.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was for me.
Well, best of luck with it all, and I'll be sure to add a few comments for anyone in the bottom of the video, but anything else that comes to mind, we can add it as great reading and inspiration as well.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Take care. Bye.